This video will introduce you to some methods for addressing counterarguments in an argument paper or a research paper. First, let's define counterargument. A counterargument is an opposing argument to the one the writer is presenting. Rather than ignoring a counterargument, a strong writer will usually address it through concession and refutation. When contemplating counterarguments, you need to consider both of the following. First, what general opposing arguments might people have to your primary claim? In other words, you want to think about your position on your topic, and you want to think about the opposite side of that position, or the other possible positions somebody might take. What is their position? You want to think generally. Then you need to think specifically. Once you've figured out your argument and the specific sub-arguments you're going to make, you want to consider what opposing arguments people might have to the specific claims, logical reasoning, or evidence that you have used. Depending on your argument, you may need to address both general and specific counterarguments. So knowing whether or not you need to do this can't really be determined until you have figured out your thesis and what evidence you are going to use to build that thesis. So deciding whether or not to include counterarguments is something you're going to do in the later stages of the process. One way of addressing counterargument is through concession. Concession is an acknowledgement that an opposing argument may be true or reasonable. It's basically saying, okay, other side, you're right about blank. So often the question arises, why would a writer want to make a concession? Why would you want to admit that you agree with somebody on the other side? Well, the primary reason is that it helps build your ethos by showing that you are aware of other possible positions, that you've conducted sufficient research, and that you are a reasonable human being. If you're able to show agreement with someone on the other side, it shows that you can be willing to make compromise, that you are considerate, and that you've given thought to your audience and where they might be as they're approaching your own argument. If you're going to make a concession, the best place to do it is usually at the beginning of your argument. You want to build your ethos, establish a connection with your audience first, then you develop your position in the remaining body paragraphs. Another method of addressing counterarguments is through refutation. Certainly you can incorporate both concession and refutation into your argument depending on what you're arguing and how much space you have to build your argument. A refutation is a denial of the validity of an opposing argument. When you're creating a refutation, you want to use evidence and logical reasoning to show why the opposing argument is wrong. You also want to be careful not to create argumentative fallacies when refuting potential counterarguments. In other words, you don't want to have flaws in your own logical reasoning or to set yourself up for further attack by having errors in the way that you're addressing the counterarguments. When deciding where to incorporate refutation, consider your audience and your argument carefully. You have various options. You could, as with concession, include refutation in the beginning of the paper. You could save it for the end, depending upon whether or not you need to have made your argument in order to come up with refutations. Or in some cases, you might be able to refute sub-arguments within each body paragraph, kind of a way of dealing with counter-arguments as they may arise naturally within your own argument. My best advice for dealing with this kind of thing is to get another set of eyes on your paper. It can be very hard to know what counter-arguments are out there, even when you've done research, because when you're coming up with your own ideas, you may not be aware of the flaws other people see. So it can be really helpful to have someone else look at your outline or a first draft and ask them, what counter-arguments do you have? What do you oppose to in anything I've said? And ask them to make some notes about it and to help you figure out the best place to insert that information. It can't hurt to get a second opinion.